Today I'm talking to the LSE Public Policy Group's Simon Bastow about his recent blog for us on lockup quotas in US prisons. His blog's in response to an earlier piece from the In the Public Interest organization, which accused prison lockup quotas of being a tax on low crime. So Simon wrote a blog in response to that, discussing what he thought about their findings. So my first question for Simon is, just to tell us briefly, what are lockup quotas and why are they controversial?
Well, hi Chris, thanks for having me on. I'm keen to talk about the recent blog by the US think tank In the Public Interest, because I thought it was an interesting piece of research for a start, and it looked at 60-odd contracts for private prison arrangements, and it raised this interesting issue of lockup quotas. Basically, lockup quotas are an agreement between a commissioning state government and a private sector prison provider, which guarantees a certain level of demand or a certain level of filling the prison with prisoners to a certain level. So in most cases, there's a guarantee that the state will fill the prison to 90%, 95%, or even 100%. And essentially, it boils down to a sort of a contractual constraint on the state to provide enough prisoners for the private sector prison. It's controversial for a number of reasons. I think in recent years the US states have attempted to reduce their prison populations, and as some of my graphs on this blog show, that's been the case in a good half of them. But of course, as the prison populations decrease, there's pressure on the private sector to sort of defend their market, as it were, and try and shore it up against any sort of further reduction and loss of revenue. So In the Public Interest have interpreted this as a sort of, as you say, as a tax on low crime, on a constraint on state populations to actually be able to reduce their prison the number of prisoners they lock up. In some ways, it's an interesting argument. In some ways, there are problems with it. I think also, if you believe that private prisons deliver are in any way less effective, perhaps more expensive, less humane than public sector prisons, then you can also argue that this sort of artificial constraint on the number of prisoners you lock up in private prisons is in a way a kind of sign of an inefficient market and the sustaining of an inefficient market. So it's controversial for a number of reasons. Prisons are a controversial and emotive topic, so we're rarely free of controversy in that respect.
Okay, thanks. So one thing you've looked at in your article is how US prison populations have changed since 2010. So how does this actually relate to the market share that private prisons have within the states themselves?
Well, it's a good question. I think in my two charts in the blog, I try and get some perspective on all of this and try and understand to what extent prison populations have dropped in the last few years. In the first chart, it's actually interesting. There's a fair distribution across the different states. There's about half of the states that have managed to reduce the size of their prison population in the last 3 years, since 2010. But then there's another half which has not had so much success in that respect. Certainly we see amongst the bigger states, California, Florida, Texas, and New York to an extent, there has been a significant reduction in the prison population, and that just shows that you can bring down the size of your prison population with policies and a little bit of sort of obligation and force when is required. In the second chart, I sort of investigate rather speculatively, I should add, the relationship between the change in the size of the prison population and the size of the private sector market share. I wanted to sort of investigate this relationship and see if actually, you could hypothesize or you could show to a certain extent that the higher the market share of the private sector, the less the ability of the US states to bring down the size of their prison population. And quite frankly, I mean, the relationship is pretty weak, weak to moderate, I would say. There are signs looking across the distribution that in some of the states with larger market shares, there's been less of a reduction. but it's still much more complex than this, and probably a basis from further research rather than any concrete result.
Okay.
You can actually see, I mean, a couple of the states that have had strong stories where private market prisons have either failed or have had quite serious examples of violence or issues with humane regimes. You can see, I mean, certainly Idaho and Mississippi have been controversial states in that respect, and those are two states which have increased the size of their prison population in the last few years. So anecdotally, there are signs that there are relationships between the two variables, but as I said, more research is required as ever.
Sure. Okay. So something else you discuss in your article is the value for money implications of running prisons at very close to capacity, sort of 95% or almost 100%. Is this something that we should aim for in both public and in private prisons?
Good question. I mean, I think if you're commissioning, if as a government you're commissioning any public sector institution, whether it be a hospital, a school, a prison, one would expect that we would try and get as much capacity out of it as we pay for. In that sense, we should look to maximise value for money. So I think in many ways, if you commission a prison for 1,000 places, then it's good value for money practice to use as much of the resources available in that sense. The problem with that is that you can show, I mean, you can prove statistically that the capacity of prisons stretch when more capacity is required. We certainly in the UK and in the US, the capacity of prisons tends to sort of be quite elastic. So it's all very well saying, well, we should be running our prisons at 100% or near enough 100% capacity, but if the standards or the measurements of capacity are stretching as well, we're actually tightening the level of capacity stress on those institutions. And sure enough, the more you tighten stress, the higher the risk becomes that you get failure, either acute or more long-term failure. So it's a very risky thing to push prisons continually like that. And I think certainly in the UK and the US, there are signs that that capacity is stretched beyond acceptable limits.
Okay. Just finally then, so one thing we'd like to do on our new USA blog is have transatlantic comparisons and lessons that are learned from the States into the UK and Europe and vice versa. So what, if any, do you think are the implications of your findings for prison policy here in the UK?
Well, I think we've always looked to the US to learn lessons, as it were, on all sorts of public management areas, and prisons is no exception. Although there are often quite big differences between the US prison system and the UK prison system, I think if you focus at the state level, actually the similarities become a lot clearer. I mean, if you were looking to position the UK, I say the UK, but actually it's the England and Wales prison system, which is its own jurisdiction. If you were looking to position the England and Wales prison system on the two charts that I've produced, you would find that they would be positioned fairly centrally amongst the cluster of US states. We have a prison population of about 85,000, and it hasn't really changed in the last 3 years. And so, if England and Wales is in the middle of this cluster, then sure enough we should be able to sort of draw lessons from different states in the US. Certainly, as I've said, half of the states have managed to reduce the size of their prison population, and we can certainly look to these states for ways in which we can reduce our own. I think we're in the middle of a so-called rehabilitation revolution at the moment. And the longer it goes on, the longer we have any kind of discernible reduction in the prison population in the UK, the more sceptical people will become about how much of a revolution this actually is. So things need to change, and we can learn lessons from the States in that respect. I think also a second lesson or area for lesson drawing might be how to balance the mix between public and private prisons. I think, again, in the UK, we're certainly, well, some of the big major private sector contractors that provide prison services are coming in for quite a lot of stick in the press and in policy communities at the moment. G4S, Serco amongst them, and you know, in the US, we're at a point where a lot of the contracts are up for renegotiation. Is a window of opportunity for policymakers and governments to really reflect on what the optimal balance is between public and private provision. And we might find that US states sort of move away from private sector. In some of the bigger ones, it might be very difficult to move away just simply because they're so reliant on a private sector influence. So understanding the balance between public and private is another really important area where the UK can learn from what's going to happen in the US over the next 3 to 5 years.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for talking to us today, Simon. Simon Bastow from the LSE's Public Policy Group. I'm Chris Gilson, Managing Editor of the LSE's USA Politics and Policy blog. You can follow the blog on USAppblog.com and LSE USA blog on Twitter. Thanks so much. See you next time.
Thank you.